The helicopter blades thundered overhead as Sarah Martinez gripped the safety harness with sweaty palms. At 32 years old, she had never imagined herself in this position, preparing to jump from a military aircraft into an active war zone. The mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly below, their rugged peaks casting long shadows in the early morning light. Sarah was not a soldier. She was a trauma surgeon from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who had spent the last 8 years working in the emergency department of Hennepin County Medical Center. Her expertise was saving lives in sterile operating rooms, not jumping out of helicopters into combat zones. But here she was, wearing military fatigues and a parachute, about to make the most terrifying decision of her life. The journey that led Sarah to this moment began 6 months earlier when she received an unexpected phone call at her apartment. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel James Harrison from the United States Army Medical Command. He explained that the military was facing a severe shortage of experienced trauma surgeons in forward operating bases, particularly in remote areas where helicopters couldn't safely land for medical evacuations. Colonel Harrison had reviewed Sarah's impressive medical record. She had completed her residency at Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country. Her specialty was emergency trauma surgery, and she had an exceptional success rate in treating complex injuries. What made her particularly valuable was her experience working with gunshot wounds, stab injuries, and severe trauma cases that were unfortunately common in urban emergency rooms. The military needed someone who could parachute into dangerous areas where wounded soldiers required immediate surgical intervention. Traditional medical evacuation procedures sometimes took too long, and soldiers were dying from injuries that could be treated if a skilled surgeon could reach them quickly enough. The program was experimental, designed to save lives in the most challenging circumstances. Sarah's initial reaction was immediate rejection. The idea seemed insane. She had no military training, no experience with parachuting, and certainly no desire to put herself in harm's way. Her comfortable life in Minneapolis included a successful career, a steady relationship with her longtime boyfriend David, and plans to open her own private practice within the next few years. However, Colonel Harrison was persistent. He explained that the program would provide intensive training in both military procedures and parachuting techniques. The commitment would be for 1 year, with the possibility of extension if she chose to continue. Most importantly, he emphasized the lives that could be saved with her expertise in forward positions where traditional medical support was unavailable. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She found herself thinking about the wounded soldiers who might die simply because they couldn't receive proper medical care in time. Her medical oath echoed in her mind. First, do no harm. But wasn't refusing to help when she had the skills to save lives also a form of harm? The next morning, Sarah called her parents in Wisconsin to discuss the opportunity. Her father, a retired firefighter, understood the calling to serve others in dangerous situations. Her mother, a nurse, worried about the risks but also recognized her daughter's exceptional surgical abilities. Both parents ultimately supported whatever decision Sarah felt was right. David's reaction was entirely different. He was furious that Sarah would even consider such a dangerous assignment. He argued that she had no obligation to risk her life for strangers, especially in a war zone. Their relationship became strained as Sarah continued to contemplate the opportunity. David gave her an ultimatum: choose him or choose the military assignment. Sarah spent weeks researching the program, speaking with other medical professionals who had served in combat zones, and soul-searching about her motivations and fears. She visited wounded veterans at the local VA hospital, listening to their stories about battlefield medical care and the doctors who had saved their lives under impossible circumstances. One conversation particularly impacted her decision. A young veteran named Marcus Williams had lost his leg in an IED explosion in Syria. He described how a surgeon had operated on him in a makeshift field hospital, working by flashlight during an enemy attack. That surgeon's quick thinking and steady hands under pressure had prevented Marcus from bleeding to death. Marcus looked directly at Sarah and said, "Doc, if you have the skills to save someone's life and you don't use them, how do you live with yourself? Those soldiers over there, they're somebody's son or daughter. They signed up to serve their country, and they deserve someone willing to serve them too." After 2 months of consideration, Sarah made her decision. She called Colonel Harrison and accepted the assignment, knowing it would change her life forever. David ended their relationship the same day, unable to understand her choice to leave their secure life together. The military training began immediately. Sarah was sent to Fort Bragg in North Carolina for an intensive 8-week program that would transform her from a civilian surgeon into a military medical officer. The physical training was brutal. She had always maintained decent fitness through regular jogging and yoga, but military conditioning was entirely different. Wake-up call came at 5 a.m. every morning, followed by grueling physical exercises, obstacle courses, and endurance training. Sarah's hands, accustomed to the delicate precision of surgery, developed calluses from rope climbing and combat training. Her body ached constantly during the first few weeks as she adapted to the demanding schedule. The parachuting training was the most terrifying aspect of her preparation. Sarah had always been afraid of heights, a fact she had somehow failed to mention during her initial interview with Colonel Harrison. Her first jump from a training tower left her shaking and nauseous, but she forced herself to continue. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, her parachuting instructor, was a gruff but patient man who had completed over 500 military jumps. He recognized Sarah's fear, but also saw her determination. "Fear is normal, Doc," he told her after a particularly difficult training session. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being scared." Gradually, Sarah began to overcome her terror of jumping. She learned to trust her equipment, to control her breathing during freefall, and to execute precise landings. By the end of her training, she had completed 15 successful jumps from various altitudes and under different weather conditions. The medical training component focused on battlefield medicine, which differed significantly from hospital emergency care. Sarah learned to perform complex surgeries with limited equipment, often in less than ideal conditions. She practiced operating by flashlight, dealing with power outages, and working while under simulated enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wong, a seasoned military surgeon, taught Sarah advanced trauma techniques specific to combat injuries. These included treating blast injuries from improvised explosive devices, gunshot wounds from high-velocity weapons, and burn injuries from vehicle explosions. The training was intensive and emotionally draining, but Sarah absorbed every lesson with determination. During her final week of training, Sarah received her deployment orders. She would be stationed at Forward Operating Base Lightning in eastern Afghanistan, supporting infantry units conducting operations against Taliban forces in the mountainous border region with Pakistan. The base was located in an extremely dangerous area where helicopter landings were often impossible due to enemy fire and difficult terrain. Her mission would be to provide emergency surgical support to wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated to larger medical facilities. When casualties occurred in remote locations, she would parachute in with a small medical team to provide life-saving treatment on site. It was exactly the type of dangerous, high-stakes medicine she had trained for. The night before her deployment, Sarah sat alone in her barracks room, writing letters to her family. She wanted them to understand her decision and to know how much she loved them. She also wrote a letter to David, expressing no regret about her choice, but acknowledging the pain their breakup had caused both of them. As she sealed the letters, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. She was no longer the comfortable suburban surgeon who worried about hospital politics and private practice opportunities. She had become someone willing to risk everything to save lives in the most dangerous places on Earth. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours with stops in Germany and Kuwait. Sarah used the long journey to review medical procedures and mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. She knew that everything she had learned in training would soon be put to the ultimate test in real combat situations. When the transport plane finally descended toward Bagram airfield in Afghanistan, Sarah pressed her face to the small window and saw the harsh, mountainous landscape that would be her home for the next year. The terrain looked unforgiving and hostile, exactly as she had expected. But she also felt a surge of purpose and determination that surprised her with its intensity. At Bagram, Sarah met the other members of her medical team. Sergeant First Class Michael Chun, a combat medic with 6 years of battlefield experience, and Captain Jennifer Walsh, an anesthesiologist who had volunteered for the experimental program. Together, they would form a mobile surgical unit capable of providing advanced trauma care in forward positions. The team spent 3 days at Bagram receiving final briefings and acclimating to the environment. Sarah learned about the specific threats they would face, including not only enemy combatants, but also the extreme weather conditions, altitude sickness, and the constant stress of operating in a war zone. On their last day at Bagram, the team received their first mission alert. An infantry patrol had been ambushed in a remote valley, resulting in multiple casualties. The wounded soldiers were trapped in an area where helicopter evacuation was impossible due to ongoing enemy fire. Sarah's team would need to parachute into the combat zone to provide emergency medical care. As Sarah put on her parachute and prepared to board the helicopter, she thought about all the events that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been living a predictable, comfortable life. Now she was about to jump into an active firefight to save the lives of wounded soldiers she had never met. The helicopter lifted off from Bagram in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying Sarah toward her first real test as a combat surgeon. She had no idea that this mission would not only challenge everything she had learned in training but would also reveal a strength and courage she never knew she possessed. As the aircraft flew through the mountain passes toward the embattled valley, Sarah checked her medical equipment one final time and prepared to take the leap that would define the rest of her life. The helicopter shuddered violently as enemy gunfire erupted from the valley below. Sarah gripped her medical bag tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs as the aircraft maneuvered through the narrow mountain pass. Through her headset, she heard the pilot's tense voice. 2 minutes to drop zone. Enemy contact confirmed. This is going to be hot. Captain Walsh grabbed Sarah's arm and shouted over the engine noise. Remember your training. Get to the casualties, establish a perimeter, and start triage immediately. Sergeant Chin checked his weapon one final time and gave both women a thumbs up. Despite the terrifying circumstances, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The jump light turned red, then yellow. Sarah moved toward the helicopter door, her legs feeling unsteady but her mind sharp and focused. Below, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness and the scattered forms of soldiers taking cover behind rocks and fallen trees. Somewhere down there, wounded men were fighting for their lives. Green light. Go, go, go. The jumpmaster's voice cut through the chaos. Sarah launched herself into the darkness without hesitation. The rushing wind filled her ears as she plummeted toward the valley floor. She counted the seconds before pulling her ripcord, just as Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her. The parachute deployed with a sharp jerk, and suddenly, the violent noise of the helicopter was replaced by an eerie silence broken only by distant gunfire. She landed hard but rolled correctly, just as she had practiced dozens of times at Fort Bragg. Within seconds, she was cutting away her parachute and shouldering her medical equipment. Captain Walsh touched down 30 feet away, and Sergeant Chin landed near a cluster of pine trees that provided immediate cover. The team quickly oriented themselves and moved toward the sound of American voices calling for a medic. The injured soldiers were positioned behind a large boulder formation about 100 yards from their landing zone. Sarah kept low as she moved across the rocky terrain, acutely aware that enemy snipers might be watching for movement. When she reached the casualty collection point, Sarah was confronted with a scene that would have been overwhelming even in a fully equipped emergency room. 3 soldiers lay wounded, their injuries ranging from severe to life-threatening. The most critically injured was Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from Texas who had taken shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade to his abdomen and left leg. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, the unit's leader, grabbed Sarah's shoulder as she knelt beside Rodriguez. "Doc, Tommy's been bleeding for 20 minutes. We've been putting pressure on the wounds, but he's getting weaker. The other 2 guys have bullet wounds, but they're stable for now." Sarah immediately began her assessment of Rodriguez. His pulse was rapid and weak, indicating significant blood loss. His abdomen was rigid and distended, suggesting internal bleeding. The leg wound was severe, with visible bone fragments and arterial bleeding that hadn't been completely controlled by the field dressings. "I need to operate right here, right now," Sarah announced to the team. Sergeant Chun set up the portable surgical kit. "Captain Walsh, get the anesthesia ready. We're going to save this kid's life." Working by flashlight and under sporadic enemy fire, Sarah began the most challenging surgery of her career. She had performed hundreds of emergency operations, but never while lying prone behind a boulder with bullets occasionally ricocheting nearby. Her hands remained steady as she made the initial incision, her years of training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. The abdominal exploration revealed a lacerated spleen and damaged blood vessels that required immediate repair. Sarah worked with incredible precision, using clamps and sutures to control the bleeding, while Captain Walsh maintained Rodriguez's anesthesia using portable equipment. Sergeant Chun provided security and assisted with the surgery when needed. For 45 minutes, Sarah operated on Rodriguez while the firefight continued around them. Other soldiers in the unit provided covering fire and called in air support to suppress enemy positions. The sound of jets screaming overhead mixed with the quiet concentration of the medical team working to save a life. As Sarah completed the abdominal repair and moved to address the leg wound, she realized that Rodriguez would lose the limb without immediate vascular surgery. The main artery had been severed, and circulation had been cut off for too long. However, Sarah had an idea that was both innovative and incredibly risky. Using a technique she had only read about in medical journals, Sarah attempted to restore blood flow by creating a bypass using a vein from Rodriguez's uninjured leg. The procedure required microscopic precision and absolute steadiness, qualities that seemed impossible to maintain under combat conditions. "Doc, you sure about this?" Sergeant Chun whispered as he watched Sarah begin the delicate vascular work. "If this doesn't work, if I don't try, he definitely loses the leg," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "I've seen this technique succeed in civilian trauma cases. Tommy's young and strong. He deserves every chance we can give him." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah performed surgery that would have been challenging in the best hospital operating room. Using specialized microsurgical instruments, she carefully connected blood vessels smaller than drinking straws while enemy mortars exploded in the distance. Her concentration was so complete that she barely noticed when shrapnel from a nearby explosion scattered dirt across her surgical field. When Sarah finally restored blood flow to Rodriguez's leg, the change was immediate and dramatic. Color returned to the limb, and she could feel a strong pulse below the repair site. The surgery had been successful, but Rodriguez was still critically injured and would need immediate evacuation to a larger medical facility. While Sarah worked on Rodriguez, Captain Walsh and Sergeant Chun treated the other two wounded soldiers. Specialist David Kim had suffered a bullet wound to his shoulder that required cleaning and suturing, but wasn't life-threatening. Corporal James Patterson had taken a bullet fragment to his thigh that had missed major blood vessels, but needed surgical removal. As dawn broke over the mountain valley, the tactical situation began to improve. Air support had successfully suppressed most of the enemy positions, and a relief column was moving up the valley to evacuate the wounded soldiers. Sarah had been operating almost continuously for 3 hours, but all 3 patients were stable and ready for transport. The evacuation helicopter arrived just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. Sarah watched as Rodriguez was carefully loaded onto a stretcher and carried to the aircraft. His vital signs were strong, and she was confident he would make a full recovery. More importantly, her innovative surgery had saved his leg. As the helicopter disappeared over the mountains carrying the wounded soldiers to Bagram Airfield, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had proven to herself and her team that the experimental combat surgery program could work. More importantly, she had saved 3 lives under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Staff Sergeant Williams approached Sarah as she packed her medical equipment. "Doc, I've been in the Army for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. Tommy would be dead if you hadn't jumped out of that helicopter. You're going to be a legend around here." Over the following weeks, word of Sarah's dramatic first mission spread throughout the military medical community. She had demonstrated that highly skilled surgeons could indeed operate effectively in forward combat positions, providing life-saving care that wouldn't otherwise be available. Sarah's team was called on for increasingly complex missions. They jumped into remote valleys to treat soldiers injured by improvised explosive devices, parachuted onto mountainsides to reach helicopter crash survivors, and operated in caves and abandoned buildings when circumstances required it. Each mission presented unique challenges that tested not only Sarah's surgical skills, but also her adaptability and courage. She learned to perform amputations by candlelight, to suture wounds while wearing a gas mask during chemical attacks, and to maintain her composure while operating under direct enemy fire. One particularly memorable mission occurred 6 weeks into her deployment. An Army Ranger squad had been ambushed while attempting to capture a high-value Taliban commander in a remote mountain village. 2 Rangers were severely wounded and trapped in a building surrounded by enemy fighters. Conventional evacuation was impossible, and the Rangers would certainly die without immediate medical intervention. Sarah's team parachuted into the village at midnight during a fierce snowstorm. The visibility was nearly zero, and the temperature was well below freezing. Sarah landed in a courtyard filled with debris and had to crawl through enemy-held territory to reach the wounded Rangers. The casualties were Sergeant First Class Robert Anderson, who had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to his chest and abdomen, and Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had taken shrapnel to her head and neck from a grenade explosion. Both soldiers were unconscious and bleeding heavily when Sarah reached them. Working in a partially destroyed building with no electricity and limited medical supplies, Sarah performed emergency surgery on both Rangers simultaneously. She had to constantly move between patients, stabilizing one while operating on the other. Captain Walsh provided anesthesia for both patients using battery-powered equipment, while Sergeant Chun maintained security and assisted with the surgeries. The operation lasted 4 hours, during which enemy fighters repeatedly attempted to overrun their position. Sarah never stopped working, even when bullets shattered windows above her operating area. Her focus was so complete that she seemed almost oblivious to the danger surrounding her. Both Rangers survived the surgery and were successfully evacuated when reinforcements arrived at dawn. Sergeant Anderson required additional surgery at a larger medical facility, but made a complete recovery. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez had suffered a traumatic brain injury, but retained full cognitive function thanks to Sarah's quick intervention. After the mission, Sarah was nominated for the Bronze Star Medal, one of the military's highest decorations for valor. The citation praised her exceptional courage and medical skill in the face of extreme danger, and noted that her actions had directly resulted in saving the lives of 2 American service members. Sarah's reputation as an extraordinary combat surgeon continued to grow throughout her deployment. Military medical personnel from other bases requested transfers to work with her team. Medical students and residents wrote letters asking for advice on preparing for combat medicine. Her innovative techniques were studied and adopted by other military surgeons around the world. However, the constant stress of combat operations was taking its toll on Sarah both physically and emotionally. She had lost 15 pounds since arriving in Afghanistan, and she rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours at night. The adrenaline of combat missions was followed by periods of exhaustion and anxiety that she struggled to manage. The breaking point came during her 20th mission, 3 months into her deployment. Sarah's team was called to treat casualties from a convoy attack on a mountain road. When they arrived at the scene, Sarah discovered that one of the wounded soldiers was her former boyfriend David's younger brother, Lieutenant Michael Chun. Sarah had known Michael since he was a teenager. She had attended his high school graduation and had even helped him with his college applications. Seeing him lying wounded and semi-conscious on the side of a mountain road was emotionally devastating. Michael had suffered severe burns over 60% of his body when his vehicle was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade. His injuries were among the worst Sarah had ever encountered, and she knew that his chances of survival were minimal even with the best possible care. For the next 6 hours, Sarah worked with desperate intensity to save Michael's life. She performed multiple surgical procedures to address his burns, respiratory injuries, and internal trauma. Every technique she had learned, every skill she had developed, was brought to bear in the fight to save someone she cared about deeply. Despite her heroic efforts, Michael died on the operating table as Sarah fought to repair his damaged lungs. His final words were a message for his family, which he asked Sarah to deliver personally. The loss was devastating for Sarah, who felt she had failed someone who trusted her with his life. That night, Sarah sat alone outside the medical tent and cried for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan. The emotional weight of all the soldiers she had treated, the constant danger, and the loss of Michael combined to create a crisis that threatened to overwhelm her. Captain Walsh found Sarah sitting in the darkness and sat beside her without speaking. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Jennifer. Every time I lose someone, it feels like I'm losing a piece of myself." "You've saved 43 lives in the past 3 months," Walsh replied quietly. "Michael was hurt too badly for anyone to save. You gave him every chance possible, and you were with him when he died. That matters more than you know." The conversation marked a turning point for Sarah. She realized that her mission wasn't to save every wounded soldier. That was impossible. Her job was to give each patient the best possible chance of survival and to ensure that no one died alone or without hope. With renewed determination, Sarah continued her mission in Afghanistan. She developed new surgical techniques specifically designed for battlefield conditions, trained other military medical personnel in advanced trauma care, and continued to risk her life jumping into combat zones to save wounded soldiers. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah reflected on how profoundly the experience had changed her. She was no longer the comfortable suburban surgeon who had answered Colonel Harrison's phone call a year earlier. She had become someone capable of extraordinary courage and skill under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The final mission of Sarah's deployment came on a bitterly cold February morning when intelligence reports indicated that a missing Navy SEAL team had been located in a remote cave system near the Pakistani border. The SEALs had been conducting a classified operation when they disappeared 3 days earlier. Satellite imagery suggested that at least some team members were still alive, but wounded. Sarah's team received orders to parachute into the mountainous region and locate the missing SEALs. The mission was extremely dangerous, not only because of the treacherous terrain and severe weather conditions, but also because the area was known to be heavily occupied by Taliban forces who were actively searching for the missing Americans. As Sarah prepared her medical equipment for what she knew would be her most challenging mission, she reflected on everything she had experienced over the past 11 months. She had jumped out of helicopters 26 times, performed surgery under impossible conditions, and saved the lives of dozens of wounded soldiers. Each mission had taught her something new about courage, skill, and the meaning of service. The helicopter carrying Sarah's team flew through a fierce snowstorm as it approached the drop zone. Visibility was nearly zero, and the aircraft was buffeted by winds that made precise navigation extremely difficult. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, was one of the most experienced helicopter aviators in the military, but even he expressed concerns about the weather conditions. "Doc, this is about as bad as it gets," Martinez said through the intercom. "The wind shear in these mountains could push you way off course. Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah looked at Captain Walsh and Sergeant Chun, both of whom had become her closest friends and most trusted colleagues over the past year. She could see the determination in their eyes that matched her own feelings. "Those SEALs are counting on us, Chief. We're going in." The jump was the most terrifying of Sarah's military career. The wind immediately caught her parachute and threw her far from the intended landing zone. She found herself descending rapidly toward a steep rocky slope covered with loose snow and ice. Her landing was hard and painful, leaving her with a sprained ankle and cuts on her face from the rocky terrain. Captain Walsh landed approximately 200 yards away in a small clearing, while Sergeant Chin's parachute became tangled in the branches of a dead tree, leaving him suspended 15 feet above the ground. It took nearly an hour for the team to regroup and locate each other in the blinding snowstorm. Using GPS coordinates provided by intelligence sources, the team began the difficult trek toward the cave system where the SEALs were believed to be hiding. The terrain was treacherous, consisting of steep rocky slopes covered with ice and loose snow. Sarah's injured ankle made the hike even more challenging, but she refused to slow the team's progress. After 3 hours of difficult climbing, the team located the entrance to the cave system. Fresh bloodstains in the snow outside the caves confirmed that wounded Americans were inside. However, Taliban fighters had also discovered the location and were attempting to flush out the hidden seals using grenades and automatic weapons fire. Sarah and her team took positions behind a rock formation and assessed the tactical situation. They could hear American voices from inside the caves, indicating that at least some of the seals were still alive. However, enemy fighters controlled the high ground around the cave entrance, making approach extremely dangerous. Sergeant Chun used his radio to establish contact with the trapped SEALs. The response came from Petty Officer First Class Jason Murphy, the team's medic, who reported that 3 of his teammates were severely wounded and required immediate medical attention. The team leader, Senior Chief Petty Officer William Davis, had been shot multiple times and was losing blood rapidly. "Doc, we've got maybe an hour before Davis bleeds out." Murphy's voice crackled through the radio. "The other guys are stable for now, but they need surgery soon. We're pinned down pretty good here, and we're running low on ammunition." Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible 11 months earlier when she was a comfortable civilian surgeon in Minneapolis. She announced to her team that she was going to crawl through the snow and reach the cave entrance under cover of the ongoing firefight. "That's suicide, Doc," Captain Walsh protested. "Those Taliban fighters will cut you down before you get halfway there." "Maybe," Sarah replied, checking her medical equipment one final time. "But if I don't try, Davis is definitely going to die. I didn't come this far to lose someone because I was afraid to take a risk." Sarah began her approach to the cave entrance by crawling on her stomach through the deep snow. She moved slowly and carefully, using every piece of cover available while enemy bullets whistled overhead. The distance was only 75 yards, but it took her nearly 30 minutes to reach the cave entrance. When Sarah finally reached the wounded SEALs, she found conditions even worse than she had expected. Senior Chief Davis was unconscious and had lost massive amounts of blood from bullet wounds to his chest and abdomen. Petty Officer Mark Stevens had suffered a severe head injury from a grenade explosion and was showing signs of brain trauma. The third casualty, Petty Officer Robert Taylor, had a compound fracture of his leg and suspected internal injuries. Working by flashlight in the cramped cave while enemy fire echoed outside, Sarah began the most complex triage and treatment situation of her career. She had 3 critically wounded patients, limited medical supplies, and no possibility of immediate evacuation. Her decisions in the next few hours would determine whether these elite warriors lived or died. Sarah began with Senior Chief Davis, whose injuries were the most immediately life-threatening. She started in 4-line and began blood transfusion using supplies she had carried in her medical pack. The bullet wounds required immediate surgical exploration to control internal bleeding. Using the cave wall as a makeshift operating table, Sarah performed emergency surgery on Davis while Taliban fighters continued their assault on the cave entrance. Petty Officer Murphy assisted with the surgery while the other uninjured SEALs maintained defensive positions at the cave mouth. The abdominal surgery revealed extensive damage to Davis's liver and small intestine. Sarah worked with extraordinary precision despite the cramped conditions and poor lighting. She repaired the damaged organs using techniques she had perfected during her months of combat operations, all while the sounds of battle raged outside their underground sanctuary. After stabilizing Davis, Sarah moved to treat Stevens's head injury. The evaluation revealed a depressed skull fracture that was putting pressure on his brain. Without immediate surgical intervention, Stevens would suffer permanent brain damage or death. Performing neurosurgery in a cave with basic equipment was arguably the most challenging procedure of Sarah's medical career. She had to relieve pressure on Stevens's brain by removing bone fragments and controlling bleeding from damaged blood vessels. The procedure required absolute precision, as the slightest mistake could result in paralysis or death. For 2 hours, Sarah operated on Stevens while enemy mortars exploded near the cave entrance. Her concentration was so complete that she seemed unaware of the chaos surrounding her. Captain Walsh, who had managed to reach the cave during a lull in the fighting, provided anesthesia using portable equipment. The surgery was successful, and Stevens's neurological function began to improve immediately. However, Sarah knew that he would need advanced neurosurgical care at a major medical center to prevent long-term complications. While treating Taylor's leg fracture and internal injuries, Sarah learned that a rescue operation was being organized. Special operations forces were moving into the area to extract the SEALs and eliminate the Taliban forces that had them trapped. However, the weather conditions were preventing helicopter evacuation, meaning the wounded SEALs would have to be carried out overland. As the rescue operation commenced, Sarah realized that her medical work was far from finished. The injured SEALs would have to endure a difficult evacuation through mountainous terrain in sub-zero temperatures. Keeping them alive during the journey would require constant medical monitoring and treatment. The extraction took 8 hours, with Sarah and her team providing continuous medical care while special operations forces fought running battles with Taliban units throughout the mountain region. Sarah administered blood transfusions, monitored vital signs, and adjusted medications while being carried on improvised stretchers across some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. All 3 wounded SEALs survived the evacuation and were successfully transported to Bagram Airfield, where they received advanced medical care. Senior Chief Davis made a complete recovery and returned to active duty 6 months later. Petty Officer Stevens required extensive rehabilitation for his brain injury, but retained full cognitive function. Petty Officer Taylor recovered completely from his injuries and also returned to special operations. The successful rescue of the SEAL team became Sarah's final and most celebrated mission in Afghanistan. Military leadership praised the operation as an example of exceptional courage and medical skill under extreme conditions. Sarah was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her parachute insertion under enemy fire and the Silver Star for her heroic medical actions in saving the lives of the wounded SEALs. However, the most meaningful recognition came from the SEALs themselves. Senior Chief Davis wrote a letter to Sarah's parents describing how their daughter had risked everything to save his life and the lives of his teammates. The letter concluded, "Your daughter is the most courageous person I have ever met. She jumped out of a helicopter in a blizzard and crawled through enemy fire to reach us. Then, she performed miracles with her medical skills. We owe our lives to her." When Sarah's deployment ended in March, she had completed 27 combat missions, performed surgery under enemy fire 31 times, and saved the lives of 68 wounded soldiers. Her innovative surgical techniques had been adopted by military medical units around the world, and her courage had inspired a new generation of military medical personnel. The return to civilian life presented unexpected challenges for Sarah. After a year of constant danger and life-or-death decisions, the routine practice of medicine in a peaceful hospital seemed almost mundane. She struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and the psychological impact of everything she had experienced in Afghanistan. Sarah spent several months working with military psychologists and counselors who specialized in helping combat veterans readjust to civilian life. She learned coping strategies for dealing with post-traumatic stress and began to process the emotional impact of her experiences in a healthy way. 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, Sarah received a phone call that would once again change the direction of her life. Colonel Harrison, who had originally recruited her for the combat surgeon program, explained that the military wanted to expand the program based on her success. They were seeking her help in training other civilian surgeons for similar roles. Sarah agreed to become the chief instructor for the Combat Surgical Response Program, teaching other doctors the skills and mental preparation necessary for battlefield medicine. She developed training curricula, supervised parachute instruction, and shared her experiences with doctors who were preparing for their own deployments. Her work training other combat surgeons became Sarah's new mission. Over the next 5 years, she prepared more than 200 doctors for deployment to combat zones around the world. Her students served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other dangerous locations where their skills saved countless lives. Sarah also began speaking at medical conferences and universities, sharing her experiences and encouraging other doctors to consider military service. She wrote a book about her time in Afghanistan, with all proceeds donated to organizations that support wounded veterans. The relationships Sarah had formed during her deployment remained strong years later. She maintained regular contact with many of the soldiers whose lives she had saved, attending their weddings, meeting their children, and celebrating their successes in civilian life. These connections reminded her daily of why her sacrifice had been worthwhile. 10 years after her return from Afghanistan, Sarah had established herself as one of the leading authorities on combat medicine in the United States. She served as a consultant to the Pentagon on military medical issues, testified before Congress about veteran health care, and continued to train new generations of combat surgeons. Sarah never remarried, though she maintained close relationships with several men over the years. She often said that her experience in Afghanistan had changed her so profoundly that it was difficult to relate to people who had never faced life or death situations. However, she found deep satisfaction in her work and in the knowledge that she had made a lasting difference in the world. The most poignant reminder of Sarah's service came in 2024 when she received an invitation to attend the wedding of Tommy Rodriguez, the young soldier whose life she had saved during her very first mission in Afghanistan. Rodriguez had recovered completely from his injuries, had become a successful businessman, and credited Sarah with giving him the chance to build a family and career. At the wedding, Rodriguez introduced Sarah to his bride and announced to all the guests, "This is Dr. Sarah Martinez. She jumped out of a helicopter to save my life when I was 19 years old. Everything good that has happened to me since then is because of her courage and skill." As Sarah looked around the wedding reception, filled with Rodriguez's family and friends celebrating his happiness, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a comfortable suburban surgeon who had never imagined herself capable of extraordinary courage. She had ended as someone who had proven that ordinary people could accomplish incredible things when they were willing to risk everything for others. The helicopter jump that had terrified her so much during her first mission had become a symbol of her willingness to leap into the unknown in service of something greater than herself. Sarah had discovered that true courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite being afraid when lives hung in the balance. Her legacy extended far beyond the individual lives she had saved. The combat surgeon program she had helped establish continued to operate years later, with her students saving lives in conflict zones around the world. Her techniques and innovations had become standard practice in military medicine, improving survival rates for wounded soldiers everywhere. Most importantly, Sarah had proven that exceptional dedication and courage could emerge from the most unexpected places. She had answered a call to service that had transformed not only her own life, but also the lives of everyone she had touched along the way. As she watched Tommy Rodriguez dance with his new wife, surrounded by family and friends whose lives had been made possible by a split-second decision to jump from a helicopter into danger, Sarah knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. She had found her true calling in the most unlikely circumstances and had used it to make the world a better place, one saved life at a time.